Okay, hi everyone. This is Olivia coming to you from my home. Welcome for those of you who are just joining just now. Please take a peek in the chat box and find the link to sign in. It's a simple form. My colleague Phil is also here co-hosting, so if you have questions or trouble with the link or trouble signing in, you can ask in the chat box and he will be monitoring that. So let's just get situated a little bit. All right, so I think we are recording. So please know that we are recording this session today, and that means that I will be able to send you a link to the recording so you can go back and watch and reference anything that you may have missed or just watch it again. So welcome, let's get going. So first of all, I just want to introduce myself. I was watching in the waiting room and seeing some familiar names. And so if you know who I am, this is redundant, but I wanted to start off and just say a little bit about myself. My name is Olivia Mulcahy. I work at the Illinois Resource Center. We provide workshops like this and support to teachers in districts all over Illinois, and we have for over 40 years. We provide these professional development sessions as part of a relationship with ISB, and so I want to acknowledge them. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I am fine with they, them, ella. I mention that because I think for a couple of reasons. I do not identify as non-binary, but often these are pronouns used for people who identify as non-binary. And they are also pronouns that are considered neutral. So if you are not sure of someone's gender, it is a way to signal that you're not making assumptions about their gender. So I put it in there just to normalize the use of inclusive language and to remind us that though we are very used to thinking of they, them, and ella as plural pronouns, they are in fact also used quite grammatically correctly as singular pronouns. So wanted to mention that. I also want to call attention to some of the lenses and some of the aspects of my identity that I think are relevant, particularly for today. So I'm an educator. I've been an educator for over 20 years. I've been a middle school teacher. I was a district leader in Chicago. I've been doing professional development for a long, long time. I've taught a variety of graduate courses. So those are some of my kind of professional hats that I have worn and the perspectives and the experiences I bring to this work. I also, as I mentioned, I do not identify as non-binary. I identify as a cisgender heterosexual woman, but I am aware of that, especially as we kick off Pride Month. June is Pride Month, and so I want to acknowledge that that is a lens that I bring, but also an ally and co-conspirator to the LGBTQ Two-Spirit community. Another lens that I bring is as a parent. So I am living this moment both as an educator and as a parent of 3 kiddos, and also as a Latinx and white person. So I just, again, want to acknowledge for anyone who's just joining that these are the lenses I bring. Obviously, there are other aspects to my identity. This is just kind of what I think is important to acknowledge at the onset to say these are experiences and perspectives and aspects of my identity that inform the work I do. And so I think each of us can reflect on what are those aspects of our identity and when do we bring those forward, and how do we show up to the learning we're going to do. So that said, I'll move on. Also want to acknowledge the land that we occupy. This reflects the indigenous peoples that, for whom the space where my house stands is a traditional homeland. But I also want to acknowledge all the original peoples of this area, and to recognize the diverse indigenous nations that reside in this area today. But in particular, want to name the Kickapoo, the Peoria, the Potawatomi, the Miami, and the Sioux. I think, I wrestled with how in the world to acknowledge this moment. For everyone that is here, I want to recognize that today is a unique day. It has been a unique month. It's been a unique time for all of us. And so I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. And in the spirit of the topic we're about to explore today, I want to acknowledge that everyone is experiencing this differently. There's incredible variability in how we ourselves, how our students, how their families, how our families are having this moment. So how we are experiencing the pandemic, how we are experiencing the violence that we have been witnessing and experiencing in different ways in the world, how we're making meaning of that, how we are understanding that and coping and understanding that and bringing those experiences and perceptions and understanding to the work that we continue to do. So it's a lot. It's heavy and it's a lot. And it's different for each of us. And so it's important to me to recognize that, to let you know, like, it's heavy for me. It's a lot for me. I recognize it's a lot for all of us. And I think it also, it behooves us to have a kind of a heightened awareness of the lenses we need to bring to this work. Not just today in exploring universal design for learning, but the lenses we must refine and get better at. And so I'm going to name a few of them that I think are most relevant in this moment. And I'm by no means an expert in all of these lenses, but it is work that is ongoing for me and work that I'm doing to be a better educator and a better person. So, so the first lens I want to name is disability justice. The concept of universal design for learning came out of the world of special education and serving students with disabilities. And so I don't want to lose sight of that. I want to understand the origins of that and make sure we all do, and we all are aware of that. Excuse me. Let's have some coffee. Another lens I think is important to acknowledge and continue to refine is a trauma-informed lens. You've likely been hearing this term a lot. There have been a lot of people talking about it. I would caution you to find really credible sources to learn about trauma-informed education. And later, when I share some resources with you, I'll give you one person to get a start with learning about trauma-informed education. So I'll name her Alex Chevron-Benet, and also I would recommend Dulce Marie Flecha are two names that you can seek out for good information about trauma-informed education. Another lens that's important to think about is our anti-bias, anti-racist lens. Often this is shortened to ABAR. anti-bias, anti-racist. And the idea there is that it's a lens that calls upon us to really look at the work that we do with an active, anti-racist, pro-justice, pro-liberation approach. And so because of everything that's been happening for hundreds of years and how that is coming to a crucial point right now, and we're seeing the results of perhaps not acknowledging that in all the ways we could. I think it's important to bring that lens. Also, again, I mentioned it's Pride Month, so our LGBTQ2 spirit, the 2S stands for Two Spirit, which is a term from our Indigenous communities. And I want to make sure that we are aware of bringing that inclusive lens, both because it's Pride Month, because of the legislation in Illinois that has been put in place, and the recognition of the need for added protections for trans youth that have all been in the news recently. So I want to make sure we call out that lens. And finally, the culturally and linguistically relevant, responsive, and sustaining lens. That is kind of, that's where I started thinking about developing this workshop, is how to bring that lens to the idea of UDL and make sure that those are integrated together. And so bringing a culture and language lens to this work. I've taken some time with this, and that's intentional, that's deliberate. I want to make sure that we acknowledge that these lenses are not just things we take on and off, and that we think about only when in certain situations, and also to recognize the concept of intersectionality, which was conceptualized by a scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. And recognizing that though you have likely come here today because you are an educator of multilingual learners, or you want to get more informed about serving your multilingual community, that our students and our families in our multilingual communities have intersectional identities. They, may identify as LGBTQ2S. They may identify, they may have disabilities. They may be experiencing trauma and racism. And so these are not things that exist in compartments, but rather in integrated ways in our communities. So I don't mean to belabor it, but I really want to emphasize the need for bringing this awareness and to continue doing the work. Again, not expecting anyone, and I'm certainly not an expert in all of these, but actively learning and committing to continuing that. So kind of segue into our main topic today, I thought this was a really helpful quote. This comes from Cornelius Minor. I'll have a link to this article for you later at the end. I will read it aloud for anyone who is listening and not able to see the screen right now. Being an advocate for Black lives does not mean that I'm an advocate against any other lives. When we make the conscious decision to address persisting injustices, this broadens access to justice for everyone. So this highlighted part, this last sentence, is a description of universal design for learning. It is the fundamental concept that is at the heart of UDL. This idea that when we address an issue, when we address a barrier, and we work to remove that barrier in the environment, that it opens up access for everyone, not just the person who is actively impacted by that barrier. And so I thought that was kind of a nice way to bring us from all of the things we are consuming and learning and trying to make sense of in the world, and bring our focus to this work today. So I've just said a lot. And so what I'd like to do is just take a moment to invite you to check in with yourself, check in with the sensations in your body, check in with your breath. Take a quiet moment if you want to share in the chat how you're feeling. That's one way that we process this. If you would like to just take a moment to be quiet and process what I've said, I'm going to allow us that moment to do that. All right. So here's what we're talking about today. In this workshop, we are going to look at UDL. What are the principles? What is this concept? And how can it inform our approach to how we teach students in our multilingual communities? We're going to explore some structures, strategies, and tools. And then the part where I'm going to invite you to ideate and plan for applying these ideas. We're going to do that through a module that I will share with you in a moment and explain in a moment. So right here. So today we are meeting for approximately 1.5 hours. We're aiming to be done by 10:30. And before we go, I will walk you through a module for self-guided learning that should take you about 3.5 hours. That's going to vary for everyone. Obviously, I'm approximating how much time going through the module thoughtfully will take. And after completing both of those, so participating today in the workshop and then going through the module, and again, I'll explain more. You'll have links to a document to document your learning and record your reflections. And once you turn that in, you will receive an evaluation and be eligible for the ECPTs, so 5 credits. So that's the 1.5 hours today, and then 3.5 hours. That will be over the course of the next 2 weeks. So you don't have to sit for 3.5 hours and do it. You can do that asynchronously. I should say, if there are any questions, hopefully I will address them over the course of the session, but any questions that are in the chat, I'll try my best to kind of read through those. We'll have 2 opportunities for you to get into breakout rooms and just talk. It's hard to just listen for this long, and I want to give you a chance. Some of us process better by just talking it out. So some of you aren't going to love the breakout room, I acknowledge that, but I do want to give you that opportunity to process with each other. So during those times, I will be taking a better look at the chat and trying to address any questions that have come up, because I can't do everything all at once. So, so that's how that's going to work. I want to suggest some norms for us today. I'll talk more about norms later, but norms are something that I think are very important to give time to. And though we have limited time today, I want to suggest some. I want to suggest that we take care, whatever that means for you. If that means, stepping away for a moment, taking care of something, if that means whatever it is, I want you to take care. These are heavy, heavy times, and our wellness is always the point of all of this. If we are not well and thriving, we need to take care of that. I want to offer the idea of making room for multiple ways of knowing. I acknowledge that we're all experiencing this moment in different ways. We all have different perceptions. And we understand the world through all of these lenses and our lived experiences. And so we have multiple ways of knowing. We have multiple ways of making meaning in the world. So we want to make room for each other to do that. There isn't one way that we need to engage with this, this content and this experience. I'd like us to be resources to each other. I'm here because I have some experience and some expertise, but we all have some experience and expertise. And so, you know, in this setting, using the chat, using the breakout opportunities are ways to be resources to each other. And finally, I always like to offer people this idea of observing and enjoying the languages and the languaging. So auditorially, you're going to be listening to me a whole lot today, but as you engage with each other, and again in the chat and the breakout, really think about how we're all using languages and how we're using our communicative repertoire. That's something, again, we'll talk about shortly as well, a little bit more. All right, so what is universal design for learning? So the concept of universal design, not universal design for learning, but the concept of universal design comes from Ronald Mace. And he started the Center for Universal Design at North Carolina State University. And he was an architect. He was an architect and a product designer and a professor. And he came up with this idea and was really interested in finding ways to incorporate this awareness in the design process that, that usability by everyone is a priority and is a value. And recognizing that there's such variability that, that sticking to one idea of what's normal and then adapting things and specializing things doesn't work as well and isn't as inclusive as really thinking from the outset about what is going to be maximally accessible by increasingly more people. So the idea of universal design comes from Ron Mace. Often when you hear about universal design for learning, you will see this comic. And so again, for anyone who's not getting the visual at this moment, I will describe. So in this comic, we have an adult who is shoveling snow off of a staircase to get into a school building. And there's a child in a wheelchair who says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the adult says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you." And the child in the wheelchair wisely says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." So this idea that if we design, in this case, it's a literal physical access issue, right? If we design things so that more people can use them, instead of saying, "Oh, you're a special case, you in the wheelchair, so you have to wait." And instead of saying a ramp is something that everyone can use for access. So that's the metaphor you will often see associated with universal design for learning. So for, so universal design for learning is something that was developed by a group called CAST. And a gentleman, one of the founders of this idea and this organization is David H. Rose. And so universal design for learning embraced that idea of maximizing access, not just in architecture and in products, but really thinking about curriculum and instructional practices and school environments and how can we bring that spirit of universal design to learning. And so universal design for learning, also known as UDL, is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. So this group really looked at brain research and really looked critically at what adaptive technologies and assistive technologies and all the design that goes into learning environments, and came up with this framework. So as with most things, it's important to define our terms, and also it's also helpful to look at what they are not. So I'll go through this quickly. So UDL is a framework. It is not an approach, or it's an approach and a framework. It's not a checklist. It's not a set of strategies to do or to get done. You know, as we learn, as we go through these PDs, sometimes we get overwhelmed by like, oh, that's one more thing I have to do. But UDL really isn't like a set of strategies that you have to do that's one more thing on your plate. If we think of it as the plate, it's the framework that helps us make sense and organize the choices we make and the rationale for why we are making those instructional decisions and those curricular decisions. So it's flexible and focused on variety, right? It's not prescriptive. It's not, here are the 10 things you have to do, and then now you're doing universal design for learning. But it's flexible, and it's really rooted in teachers knowing their community well, knowing students well, and being committed to designing in a way that anticipates in an inclusive way what are going to be the barriers in the environment. So in that sense, I believe it's great teaching, but when people say, well, it's just good teaching, it really is more deliberate than that. It's very deliberate about removing barriers, about being proactive, about anticipating what those barriers are going to be, and designing curriculum, practices, and environment with an understanding of that variability. So the one thing we can count on always that is constant is that there is going to be variability in our classroom. No matter, you know, so thinking about English learners, right? Some of us may teach where all our English learners speak the same home language. But even within that, we know there's tons of variability in their relationship to the language and the practices they use. So we know that there's variability. Some of us teach in super multilingual contexts. Some of us, you know, there's heterogeneity and homogeneity depending on how we look at it, but we know that there's always variability. So, so UDL, I want to be clear, is not differentiation either. Differentiation really looks at the individual needs of a child and adapts things accordingly. And UDL really looks at variability, the whole spectrum of variability, and adapts and designs the environment to account for that. So the focus is on the environment and removing barriers there, whereas differentiation is focused on the individual and meeting individual needs. So there can be differentiation within UDL, but they are not one and the same. So UDL doesn't mean one size fits all and now everybody's fine and I don't have to worry about individuals. UDL minimizes the need to adapt and adjust and specialize for all the individual needs, because it's proactive about thinking about minimizing that. All right. So I'm going to give you a chance to, I just said a lot of words. I want to give you a chance to just kind of make some sense together. What did you just hear? What is UDL? So you're likely bringing some notions of what you think it is from before I started talking, and now I've added some information. So I'm going to put you into some breakouts and just give you maybe 3 minutes to give that some thought and share with each other some good definitions. So I'll put you in groups of 6 to 7. In terms of norms, I want you to feel free to engage as you will. But if you are not in that place to speak, I think that's fine too. So I want to give, so you can use this as just a chance to process. So 2 to 3 minutes, we'll be inviting you now. All right, welcome back. Hope that gave you a chance to process and to clarify with each other and be resources to each other and observe each other's languaging. As promised, I did check out the chat. So I popped something in there when you get a chance to look. And I see that some of my colleagues are clarifying some of the other questions. So thank you for that. All right, let's keep going. So another way to keep enhancing our understanding, the definition of UDL, is to understand the goal of it. So the goal is to help learners become purposeful and motivated, resourceful, knowledgeable, strategic, and goal-directed. And the reason you see those color-coded in that way is because those goals are very clearly laid out in the framework that identifies the different networks of the brain that are engaged when we are learning. And so the first network that UDL attends to is the affective network, the why we are learning. So looking at the color coding, really thinking about why we're learning and getting good at giving children multiple means of engagement. If we're doing that well, produces learners who are purposeful and motivated in their learning. The recognition network is really thinking about the what of learning, right? And so as we attend to the what of learning, our goal is to develop students who are resourceful and knowledgeable. And finally, the third strategic is the strategic network, the how of learning. So to go back again, as we are thinking about that, we are developing strategic goal-directed students. So these 3 networks are how the framework is organized. And so we can take, I'm going to leave this up for a moment as we take a look. So moving down through the columns, we see those networks represented, right? And the idea is that for each of these, that we are providing multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression for our students. So that's the color coding going down those columns. As we look across in this framework, we see that one part of the learning process is really focused on access. How are we giving students multiple means of engagement so that they may access the learning we want them to do? How are we giving students multiple means of representation, right? So they can access the content we want them to engage with, the what, right? And then how are we providing multiple means of action expression so they can access through physical action, right? Through the actual process of engaging with content. So that first row, as we look across, is about access. The second row is really about building that learning, right? And building, so in terms of engagement, sustaining effort and persistence, right? So it's not just about getting them engaged and getting them interested, but really about sustaining that interest and persisting through it and remaining interested, yeah? So building on that initial access. As we go across and think about representation, it's really about the language and symbols and providing options for the language and symbols that they use to, again, understand and have that comprehensible input and work with that input to understand the content through language. And in the column for action and expression, really think about expression and communication, right? So how are they, I keep saying engaging, and I don't want to confuse us with the green column of engagement, but how are they interacting, right? With the language, with the content, and really using multiple tools to construct meaning. And finally, the third row across, the internalized row, is really about in providing options for self-regulation. So really thinking about how we're coping and self-assessing and reflecting on our learning. So our engagement isn't just about initial interest or sustaining that interest, but also about thinking about what that means to us and internalizing the meaning and kind of deciding for ourselves like how worth it that interest was, right? That's one way to think of it. Moving across to representation, thinking about internalizing that comprehension, really doing that deeper learning, not just something that they can repeat on a quiz, but that it's something that's sticky, it sticks with them. And finally, in terms of providing options for executive functions in the column of action and expression, really thinking about supporting that kind of planning and strategy to make that learning, again, continuous and sticky. So you can see how these line up with those initial goals, right? Of cultivating expert learners who are purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, strategic and goal-oriented. So this framework was developed by CAST. I'm gonna give you a link to it. They have this graphic as well as different versions of it with different things omitted so that you can use it more interactively for planning. So I'll share that with you at the end. But we're gonna take a closer look at it while we're here together, and you'll have a chance to interact with it more. So let's talk about, so now that we kind of have this idea about UDL, what it is, again, you may have already come in with a pretty good understanding of it, so maybe this affirmed it for you or gave you some new language to think about it. That'll be ongoing. But let's now look at it through this lens of language and culture. Let's think about it with being really deliberate about thinking about it for our multilingual learners. So I want to invite you to kind of focus in on this first row of access, right? And just kind of take a look and pop into the chat any ideas you have about, okay, as you look at that, what does it make you think about? What are some of those options? If we're talking about providing options for recruiting interest, for perception, and for physical action, what are going to be some of those very important options when thinking about our multilingual learners? So I'll give you a sec to think about that and to pop some ideas into the chat. So the parentheticals are in the framework, it'll direct you to different components. So as you go deeper into it, they have more detail and they have more detail in the framework. So that's something you can look at when you visit the site later. So student choice is something that Michelle is calling out. It's something that's going to be particularly important for multilingual learners. I think anytime we're talking about agency, I think there are all sorts of, you know, our traditional environments and curricula don't necessarily always uplift student agency. And I think students who feel stigma of a label of being an English learner or feel culturally that exhibiting agency is not as valued for them, I think really doubling down on that idea of student choice and agency is very important. Authentic learning projects, if we think about the authenticity, again, thinking about the cultural lenses they're bringing and the lived experiences they're bringing, giving them the options that feel authentic to them. Student-friendly rubrics to make sure that the access is possible, right? That comprehensible input in the assessment and them understanding how they will be assessed. So yes, hands-on, multimodal, absolutely. So you got it. I'm gonna move us on to the next one. You'll see it's a similar kind of exercise. So now we're looking at the second row, build. And again, looking at what are the multiple modes of expression, representation, and action and expression, multiple options. So what are some of the things that in particular are going to be barriers for our multilingual learners so that we can think about the options to provide to minimize those barriers? So yes, minimizing threats and distractions, right? Our multilingual learners, I mean, any child may be feeling threat and may be distracted, but our multilingual learners thinking about what are some of the unique ways that they may feel threatened, stigmatized, inhibited, right? And how do we take away as much of that as we can so that they can be free to learn, right? Nobody really learns very well when they're under threat and feeling distracted and distressed. Excellent. Yeah, so classroom meetings and SEL collaborative strategies. Thank you, Evelise. And I love that you mentioned this because I think really thinking about how we build those things into the routines of our classroom and integrate them into our learning, not just as a separate SEL curriculum, right? Or as something the counselors do, right? But really something that's embedded in our practice. Yes, Lisbeth, use more of the arts. We'll talk about that. So let me move us on to the next one. Same thing, right? So there's the third row of the framework. We're going to look at that. So same thing, in terms of internalizing and providing these options. Again, thinking of the barriers that might be particularly difficult and challenging for our multilingual learners, the barriers in the environment or the curriculum, and what are the options we can provide to minimize those barriers. So building confidence. So let's think about what we do to build, what are some of the options that we can put in place to help children build, self-assessment. Really, I think when we talk about assessment, I feel like there's always like this mention of like, it's important for students to have their own like self-assessment and peer review. But I feel like sometimes that's a little disingenuous. I feel like, our assessments as the adults carry more weight. And we don't always make time for as much of the self-assessment and self-reflection that we could for our students, and really giving them that credit and really figuring that into the equation. So, so helping them do that goal setting and internalize it, right? And to take it on as their own and take ownership for their learning. I think all kids, but English learners in particular often experience a lot of like, do this to get this done, right? And want to comply with that. But really to get them to internalize it, how do we give them that space to think about that? All right. I am going to keep it going because I'm way behind where I wanted to be, and I want to share more stuff with you. So keep it going in the chat. I won't be able to look at it in the moment, but you can keep it going. I will save it and look at it afterwards if there are any lingering questions that I didn't have a chance to answer, either in the course of the presentation or literally in the chat. If you have a question, you can, or if there's a question that's unanswered, I will do my best to circle back to you, or you can email me. I'll share my email at the end. All right. So as we think about, right, the brain, so UDL looks at the brain and all these different networks that we engage when we are learning, right? We can also look at the regions of the brain that are involved in language. So again, I'm not a brain expert, but as we kind of look at this image and note what are those areas of the brain that are engaged and involved with language learning and production and comprehension, right? We can kind of overlay. So there we see the overlay of these different UDL images, right? And noticing that they all overlap. So language is happening integrated with learning. It's not, again, compartmentalized in that way, right? Learning and language are happening together, making meaning through language and through our communicative repertoire is happening all at once. So how do we integrate our thinking about UDL with our understanding of our multilingual learners? So one way to kind of illustrate this is to look at this list. This was posted by CAST in a couple different places. You'll have the link to this in your resource. So these are 5 things that are just simple things that you're probably already doing or could implement fairly simply in your classroom. And so I'd like us to take a look at what are some of, as we look at each one of them, how do we apply that multilingual lens, and what's an example that we can add, right? So if we're thinking about posting lesson goals is a way for kids to know where they're going, understand the point of what they're doing. So some kids may be using that with a more strategic network and planning out how they engage with the material. And for some kids, it may be a motivator to say, okay, I understand, I need a rationale to motivate me to understand why we're doing this. So posted lesson goals can be good for a couple of reasons at least. As we think about the multilingual lens, let's also think about posting our language objectives. Now, I want to say quickly that, you know, especially for those of us who really engage a lot with inquiry-based learning, we want to post goals and objectives that give kids a sense of where they're going, but that aren't giving it away, right? So think about it as like spoiler alerts, right? Some people want the spoiler and maybe need the spoiler. And some people really don't want it. So that's one way to kind of think about when you're posting those, how to frame those and make them available. In terms of assignment options, as we think of assignment options, let's also consider what are some of the culturally based forms and formats that kids may have experience with that maybe we haven't thought of. So inviting them to say, here's some way I could accomplish this assignment, or here's a way that I could demonstrate my learning to you in a way that maybe you haven't thought of. So culturally based, and that may be, you know, in terms of ethnic culture, like their country of origin, schooling may look differently and they may offer a format that's from that experience. Or it may just be something that culturally in their community or their home or from another school they've picked up. So introducing that idea of assignment options, but really looking at it through a cultural lens. In terms of flexible workspaces, so important for everyone, right? But as we work with multilingual learners, we want to consider how each of those workspaces may serve practice and experience in the different domains. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing. regular feedback is the fourth one there for any classroom, right? And so one way that, as I apply my multilingual learner lens, one thing I think about immediately is there's the feedback that's explicit to both the lesson goals and the language objectives, right? So giving them feedback on their language practice and observations about their language use. But also being careful about the implicit feedback. What are the messages we're sending, perhaps unintentionally, and in subtle ways that are going to give them ideas about what we value. And again, like I already kind of acknowledged, there's a certain stigma sometimes for carrying that English learner label. And so how are we being attentive to the feedback we're giving them that isn't formal feedback, but perhaps more implicit or informal. And finally, as we think about digital and audio text, let's expand that when we're thinking about multilingual learners, about text in multiple languages in analog, digital, and audio formats, right? And thinking about some of the scaffolds that that technology allows for. So for example, speed control, slowing down a read aloud, or pushing pause or adding closed captioning. So those are the kinds of things that, that taking the spirit of this first list, but really kind of applying that lens and thinking about how can we take that further, being very deliberate about our multilingual kiddos. So one tool that I always come back to is this chart from WIDA of supports. So WIDA organizes them into sensory, graphic, and interactive supports. And often when we think about these supports and how we are applying them in our classroom, we're often kind of taking a differentiation approach. In terms of thinking about what individual students may need, right? And we'll look at their access information, we'll look at the data we've collected, and we will think about, okay, for kids at this level of proficiency, here are the scaffolds we're going to employ. So that is one way to use this chart, and it's an important way to do it. We can also look at this chart and reflect, what are the, how are all of these things kind of present in the ecology of my classroom and available to kids in flexible ways? Sometimes kids may choose scaffolds that we hadn't anticipated would work for them, right? So how are we making these things, how are we operating flexibly to be able to draw upon these different scaffolds in flexible and responsive ways and having them available in the environment? So this is where we can kind of think about it from a UDL approach. Making these things part of the life of our classroom for everyone on a daily basis, and then applying them strategically to individuals as necessary. So it came up in the chat, right, that UDL and differentiation are different, but that's one way we can think of how they can be used in the same space. So I've kind of alluded to this a few times, but I want to make sure it's clear. So barriers exist for our kiddos, but how we frame those barriers is really important. So we want to make sure that we are acknowledging, and UDL emphasizes this, that the barriers exist in the curriculum and the practices and the environment. The barriers are not intrinsic problems with the kids, right? So sometimes when we speak, right, and we're all being attentive to language and observing the language we use, right? We might say the student isn't used to being in school. That may be a true statement, but if that's how we frame the problem, we're going to address it as an individual thing, right? But if we reframe the problem as the school schedule expects kids to have really high stamina for sitting indoors. If we reframe the problem that way, then we can come up with design solutions that are extrinsic to the child and that will remove barriers and really recognize that the barriers are an issue in the environment, right? In the way the schedule is designed. So in the chat, why don't you take a moment to pop in some ideas about what are some design solutions if the issue is that the schedule expects kids to sit indoors for long stretches of time. What's a design solution that we can name? Movement breaks, yes. Let's, as we're thinking about our pacing for the day, if we see that like we've got 6 activities that are all going to require them to sit on their butts and it's going to take tons of time, how do we break that up? How do we take brain breaks? How do we have, you know, I used to have like baskets of toys and sensory items to break it up, to have movement, to have stations, to have them flowing through the classroom, right? How we set up our desks, how we set up the seating arrangement, all of those things, beautiful. So let's do the same thing. So in that second row, if we think of the issue, right, it may be true that a student only speaks Spanish. That may be true, but if we are articulating that as the issue, then we are going to address that again as an issue intrinsic to the student, instead of saying, all the materials are in English, and that's a problem. How do we address that problem when we frame it in that way, that the barrier is actually an issue with the environment and the curriculum? So let's think about what do we do when the materials are all in English and that's a barrier to students who only speak Spanish? So home language support, so what does that look like? That can look like having another adult come in, right? An aide or a volunteer or a tutor to come in and give home language support. It may be creating a space for cognates and doing some metalinguistic analysis and metalinguistic awareness in the classroom and making that part of the norm. It may be, you know, TPR and adding comprehensibility to the texts that are all in English, using visuals, using all those scaffolds. Another one that I love is like having the kids create the materials. You know, not all kids are going to be able to do that for different reasons, but where we have students who share home languages, who can work together, where we have kids who are literate in their home language, and can produce writing and material and video in those languages, then we're creating materials and they're authentic materials. So let's do the last one. Let's think again. The problem is not that the students' writing skills in English are not strong enough yet to explain their learning. That may be true, but that's not the problem. The problem might be that the lessons mostly involve reading, listening, and whole group discussion. It may be that the assessments that we're relying on to understand what's going on in their brain is too reliant on them writing, is too reliant on them showing it through writing. So what are some of the things we can do? Yes, and I'll just jump, and someone jumped in, sentence starters, word banks, respond orally, to, you know, invite them to do a Flipgrid, invite them to talk to you or explain it to another student and have the other student share out. So there are ways that we can remove those barriers and not, you know, get stuck in this, well, the student's writing isn't there and they're supposed to write an essay and I have no other way to understand what they've learned, right? So how do we remove those barriers and not make it the kid's problem, right? There's so many great, you're being great resources to each other. I can't read the chat fast enough, so keep those coming. I'm gonna move on because again, I'm way behind where I wanted to be. So there are 5 kind of big ideas, big practices that I wanted to make sure I share with you because I think they align with the framework of UDL very well. So jumping right in. I think norms, so the way we did norms this morning was very quickie, just acknowledging that they should be in place. But In my classroom, I actually took a very long time. I took a month. We took a month to create those agreements, and really analyzing what are the things that we need in order to function as a community. So I spent a lot of time getting to know my kids and learning about my kids and giving them space to know themselves as learners so that they could advocate for themselves, so they could say, this is how I learn best. This is what I'm working on. These are the kinds of conditions I need, and the kinds of partnerships that help me. So we took a lot of time. And so it wasn't just about discipline as this separate, divorced thing from learning, but it was about, the behavior management was just kind of handled by looking at how we learn and inviting kids to really build the classroom norms that were going to work for us as a community that year. So investing time in that is so, so important. So in a perfect world, I'd have more time to invite you to look at where this concept of norms kind of fits into the framework. In the interest of kind of moving it along a little more quickly, I'll just say I think that the norms really can address the whole framework. So if we say it's a norm to have to use our entire language repertoire when we're making meaning, right? And we may have certain times when we want to focus on one language, our home language or on English, whatever the target language is, we may have that, but setting a norm that multilingualism is valued, right? And looking at the behaviors that reflect that. Setting norms for, having just a variety of scaffolds and things available to us to help us. Setting a norm to be resources to each other. I think that really addresses the whole framework. Another idea I'm going to drop on you more quickly than I'd like is this idea of multilingual ecologies and translanguaging spaces. So again, you'll have a resource if this is a new idea to you or these are new terms. There's a link in the module where you can dig into this a little more. So I'll just leave this seed with you, right? That when the kids who are our bilingual kids or our multilingual kids are multilingual all day long. So they have a multilingual ecology in their brain. They are translanguaging all day long. We may not see it, right? So translanguaging just means using the different features from different language systems as part of their entire communicative repertoire. And they're doing that all the time in their brains. So making it welcome and permissible and part of the ecology to recognize that kids are multilingual and to have them bring multilingual ways of knowing and multilingual ways of expressing themselves to the environment, right, is anticipating that variability and creating a safe space for that variability to show up. This idea of learning in between languages and culture is something that I've been working on for a while, and you can read about that on my blog. I'll give you the link for that at the end. And again, in the module, there will be a way to dig more into that. Right, and so we can look, I see this existing kind of in that middle language and symbols, right, in the representation kind of all down that column, and then also in action and expression, right, really thinking about how kids, not just the language they input and output, but how that helps them make meaning. And, and then engagement, when kids see themselves reflected and their language reflected and their language practices valued, that increases engagement. So again, kind of hits on many spaces in that framework. Someone mentioned arts integration. This is kind of like if you have arts as part of what you do, there are built-in scaffolds to that and built-in ways that culture can be reflected. Whether it's, drawing, so in the pictures you see kids made a book and put it together in an accordion fashion with their different portraits of people they had researched. using clay, using textiles, using different things. And it really can be anything from sketch notes to, you know, incorporating the use of sketch notes in their listening and researching. And also, you know, all the way to like having maker spaces. One of the things I loved in my classroom was I just had a big box full of old magazines and greeting cards and anything. And like we would all just bring from home the stuff that was like kind of too pretty to throw away, but stuff we didn't really need to keep. And we just like started a little maker space. We didn't have 3D printers, but we just had a space where there were things that were ready to be made into something new, where there were the materials we needed to generate a new something to reflect the learning. So arts integration, I just did a session on arts, and some of you were there. You don't need to be an artist to do arts integration. You can engage partners, the kids can do art, you don't have to do it. And there are multiple ways to make art and be an artist. So something to think about. And again, I think you're seeing a pattern here. I think this fits into multiple places. When you engage with this graphic on the CAST website, you can think this through with more time, think about where does it fit in, but I think there are multiple places where arts, especially if we think of arts as part of our communicative repertoire, as art making, as a way that we express ourselves, and observing and engaging with art and participating in art as a way that we process information and are represented. So I think arts integration gets us a lot of coverage on this framework. So this infographic on the right side is one that you can find on my blog as well. And I like to make infographics because, you know, arts integration and having those visuals along with the content, it's something that I like to use for my own writing, to organize my thoughts, and to share kind of a summary of stuff I've been thinking about. So infographics, just to plug that idea, is something that students can create to share their learning as well, right? Employing their entire communicative repertoire. This particular infographic is highlighting the concept that is given to us by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, this idea of windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, that kids need to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. They need to see representation of people who look like them, sound like them, have similar experiences to them, so that they feel like their identity and their multiple aspects of their identity are valued, right? And so Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop frames books with this metaphor, right? That having a diverse library of books and a text environment that reflects different aspects of our identity and different communities is super important. So if we think about that multilingual ecology, as we think about anticipating the variability of identities in our classroom and the intersectionality of those identities, how do we create a text environment that reflects that? And that for kids for whom those identities are not something they identify with, that creates a mirror into a window into understanding those identities and communities, and sometimes invites them into those worlds. So that sliding glass doors. That's something that we can be thinking about in terms of representation and engagement, right? Really kind of hitting on all aspects of this framework again. I'm sorry I'm going so fast, but that's what happens, I guess, when there's a big giant topic to cover and also so many things going on in our brains. So I apologize for speeding it up so much. So the last idea I wanted to, last kind of big practice I wanted to share with you is this idea of caves, campfires, and watering holes. And so this is an idea from David Thornburg, where he says, you know, kids need some spaces to be quiet and alone and reflective. sometimes we need to go into a cave and just have time to think and to process and to decide how we feel about something and to have emotions and engage with content in a more private way, in a more individual way. So that's the idea of the cave. Sometimes we want campfires. We want to gather together and listen to an expert, gather together and listen to a song, you know, and someone playing the guitar. I always picture that around the campfire, right? Sometimes we want to gain that wisdom from someone who has more experience, right, with a particular thing. And so where are we creating campfires? So I would say we have a lot of campfires in traditional classrooms, sometimes a little too much campfire, but they are important. And so acknowledging that there's expertise, and it isn't always the grown-up who's leading the song. It might be someone else from the community. It might be a co-teacher. It might be a student. So, so thinking about campfires, what are the campfire spaces that we have in our classrooms? And so, and then finally having this watering hole is this idea where kids can come together and really engage with each other in collaborative ways, in ways to share their own expertise with each other directly, and kind of generate ideas from that experience. And so the idea is that we want to have spaces for all three of these, and these can exist physically in the classroom, and they can exist in virtual spaces as well, right? So as we think about, you know, how social media works as more of a watering hole, a blog may be an outlet for someone to lead a campfire, right? Reading a blog may be a way to engage as a participant in a campfire, right? A blog may also serve as an internal space, you know, for someone to reflect and think in a more cave-like kind of way. So this concept, again, is thinking about how are we setting up our space, acknowledging that we know kids are going to have to do this, right? They're going to need different ways to act. So I kind of see this myself more in that blue column around like different ways to act and express their learning. But you know, again, I think it really cuts across a lot of the framework in subtle ways. So we have about 8 minutes left. Instead of doing another breakout, I want to just invite you to do a quick pop into the chat and just share kind of one thing that's like really sticking out for you, because I want to use the remaining minutes to walk you through the modules so you know what to do with that. So I'm going to be quiet for a moment and just allow you some time in the chat to share just one thing that's resonating, one resonant idea, one thing that you're thinking about. So sometimes I saw someone asked about like when you have limited space in a room, sometimes the space is created by just having a quiet moment. Maybe they're not changing their physical orientation in the space, but maybe we just have, you know, 10 minutes that we agree is quiet time, and that gives them internal space to be in a cave, right? Even if they're not changing their seat, for example. Okay, so yes, improves learning for teachers and students. I think it's so important, like the kinds of learning and the kinds of practices we accept for ourselves are the kinds of practices we will do with our students, right? So, you know, no one wants to sit in a PD and be bored to tears or to have no agency or to feel disrespected. And so like, how do we take those same principles of like what we want to do and how we want to experience learning and make sure that we're providing that for our kids? I think that's an important point. There are a lot of comments, and I'm not going to be great at scrolling through them, and I'm conscious of the time. So again, if you have a question, email me. If there's a question that isn't answered and you want it answered, feel free to email me. I'll share my email in a moment, and I will be looking at the chat and using that to help me process the conversation today and make it even better next time. So thank you for sharing all that and being a resource to me in that way. We're going to wrap it up. We're going to look at, okay, so now how do you take these ideas and really put them into your own practice? So this is what the module is going to look like, all right? It's a one-page Google Doc. You will have a link to it in a moment. And the instructions at the top, I wrote them in larger font on the left side so that you can see. So you're going to use this hyperdoc. If you don't know what a hyperdoc is, there's a link to explain what that is. But it's a set of resources linked all together with the tasks and prompts that you're expected to move through. And so this is going to be your main tool for moving through the self-guided portion, right? And then where it says document your reflections here, when you get into this document, that's going to be a link for you. It's going to take you to a reflection sheet. So I'll explain that in a moment. So just to be clear, there's an initial reflection. So in that first row, it's reflection number 1. So coming out of this session and before you embark on this module, take some time to think about what are the current thoughts that you're having. And then I'm encouraging you to pick one from each row in that next section, right? So to learn more about UDL, to think about these lenses, and to get more detailed insight into what UDL is. You have some options. So I'd like you to pick, if you notice the second one, it's not an option, it's one task. So that's one I do want everyone to make sure they engage with. But so the idea in that first section is to pick 3, one from each row. Obviously, these are all available to you. You can look at all of them if you want to. Then take some time to do that second reflection, and then move into the next portion of planning for UDL. So pick any 2 from those 6 options. Again, you can pick more than that if you like. Reflection 3 is then after kind of that exploration, what kind of hopes and fears are you left with? What are you anticipating? And then I know it's the end of the year and some of you are actually already done with school. So we're in more of a maybe reflecting and planning mode for next year. But I want to invite you to try out the design part. Maybe you can't try out implementing it, but you can try out the design part of it. And then a final reflection. So again, there will be a link for you in this document, and it will prompt you to make a copy of this. So this is a place where you can record those reflections. You can do it all with text. You can add images. You could record yourself talking if you prefer and add a link to that. You can put it on your YouTube channel and link to that, right? So, and you have an option here of making this just a very personal private reflection that you just share with me as part of your exit slip. Or maybe you want to make this into something you share with your colleagues so that you can bring this learning back to your school community. So, so that is up to you. So you will see the directions along the top, and there will be a link to the exit slip. So in that exit slip, it will just ask you to say your name and provide a link to this document. So you'll already be prompted to make your own copy. If you want to name it with your name, it'll be easier for me to keep track of it. So Josefina's copy of the UDL reflection sheet. And then when you grab the share link, you can set it to view only. I don't want to mistakenly edit your document, but that's a way to share it with me so I can see your reflections, but not edit them mistakenly. So that is the way that you will demonstrate the reflecting and exploration that you've done, and the way you've ideated for using UDL as a framework in your setting. Once you do that, that will be, once you submit that exit slip, that will be the proof that we need. We'll confirm it. We'll give you 2 weeks. We'll give everyone 2 weeks, and then after those 2 weeks, we'll send out the evaluations, and then once you submit the evaluation, you'll get the credit. So I'll send you a follow-up email if that was hard to keep track of. And a lot of that information was in the invitation email as well, so you can reference that. So that is the link for you. I can pop it also into the chat in just one moment, but I want to say, I want to give you tips for taking care. So I want you to spend the time that you need to spend on this work in terms of how it's relevant for you. I'm not really interested in getting reflection sheets that are just like a hoop you jump through and you cut and pasted some stuff, and that's not useful to you, and that's not what I care about. What I care about is you using this resource in a way that's maximally relevant and resonant for you, to help you feel more confident in your practice and to help you do right by kids. So that's what I'm in it for. As I mentioned, there are way more resources. You could spend, a month digging through this module, and it's there for you for when you have time to do that. But for our purposes, you're kind of on your honor to spend about 3.5 hours looking through it in whatever way that's most useful to you, and creating a document that's useful to you. Maybe it's just in a cave and you're reflecting on your own, or maybe you're creating it to share with your colleagues or someone else. But the most important thing to me is that it means something to you, and that it helps you continuously refine your practice in some way. So if there are any questions, I'm going to just type in the link. If there are any questions, you can pop them into the chat and I will stick around. We're already over time, so I don't want to mess up your day with going over time, but there is the link. And thank you to all of you. I know this is just such a hard time. We have so many things pulling us different directions, such a mix of responsibilities and emotions and feelings. So thank you so much for choosing this way to spend your morning, and to acknowledge that we have a platform to make the world a little bit better through our teaching practice. I hope that we took care. I hope that it created space for you to understand this the way you needed to. And I saw that we were being resources to each other, and observing languages and languaging is something I kind of always do. I hope that was a nice prompt for you to think about that as well, if you don't already. I'm thinking a lot of you do. So thank you so much. Sorry about going a little overtime. If you have any final reflections or questions, again, stick around in the chat just for a few minutes. And if there's a question you really need answered directly, please email me. Claim.blog is my blog. I have infographics and a few articles there. And Maestra Olivia is my handle on Twitter. If you want to follow me, I try to share useful resources. I mostly use it professionally. It's not really I don't post about anything too personal. So feel free to find some professional resources there. So I'm going to put myself on mute. Thank you so much. Again, I'm going to stick around for a minute, but I'm going to resist the urge to keep talking. So I'll be on mute if you need to go. Thank you so much for your participation, and I hope you have a lovely day. Be well and take care. I'll just jump in and I want to make sure you got the message. You don't have to sign out of this Zoom. You can just leave the meeting. But so I just want to clarify that as long as you can access the module, that's where you will spend at least 3.5 hours, right? So if you send me your documentation in the next hour, like I'm going to know you didn't spend 3.5 hours. Right? So don't do that. Don't put me in that position. You can move through that module. You can take up to 2 weeks with it. Then you submit the exit slip. It's linked there. And when you submit that exit slip, that will mark kind of your end of the participation in the workshop. And we're going to wait till the end, till the due date, which is the June 16th day. It's the Tuesday, 2 weeks from now. And then everyone will get the evaluation link and their credit sent to them. That just gives us time to confirm it all at once and send that out in one batch. I am recording it. I will check and make sure it didn't get messed up. I will edit out any stuff that doesn't need to be there, I guess. We were getting started, and I will send a follow-up email with that link. So